All right, we should be recording. It is January 24, and we've got a couple things to get through. I think this may be a relatively short meeting, but I've said that before and been wrong, so we'll see. First off, I wanted to cover beta. We're getting, I think, awfully close to a place where we could at least talk about releasing a beta. In the past, we said we'd throw out dates in January and February. It seems very likely January is not going to happen, but maybe we could get a release out in February. So with that, I wanted to just jot down the things I'm aware of that we need to be working on towards beta. First, some of these already have tracking issues. If they don't have them, I'll make sure to create them afterwards. One, we need versioned image tags for webhooks, for our webhook image. I think there's already a tracking issue for this. Someone just needs to figure out how to set up the automation for this. The other thing is for API. I don't know, there's been a gap around this. There's been some discussion, but I don't know if everyone is thinking the same thing I am for this. So I wanted to just open this up, describe how I'm thinking about stable and experimental channels, and really just describe how I think these are supposed to work. So from my perspective, everything we've added since 0.4.0 is going directly to experimental channel. And the stable API is going to be identical to V1 Alpha 2. So if you look at V1 Beta 1 stable, that is V1 Alpha 2, except for some minor tweaks like typos, validation fixes, but otherwise it's largely identical. Does this line up with what others were expecting here, or do we have any thoughts on what V1 Beta 1 would look like beyond this?
Hey, Rob. I'm back.
On my audio, one second, my audio screwed up. I can see you talking. Go ahead, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, so hi everyone. Yeah, I'm back. I live. Yeah, I agree that it's good that we're pushing to beta, and that it's going to look exactly like V1 Alpha 2. I think I don't think that there's anything destructive that we need to do that would mean that we need to do a V1 Alpha 3. That would, in my mind, would be the only reason to consider not going straight to beta. It does mean that once we go to beta, we've got a much stronger guarantee about making destructive changes, and we would have to rev the API for destructive changes. But I feel pretty comfortable that that's where we're at.
Good to hear. That's what I was thinking, but yeah, great to hear from someone else as well. Any hesitation? I saw one more thumbs up about this. Anyone hesitant about this approach?
I think we need to give some love to the webhook, the validation webhook a little bit. I don't know how much of that. Oh, that's there. But if there is any other validation that we are not doing, and that might create a problem for us in future, where like users start relying on something like an unobserved behavior, that sort of protection, like that's mostly a protection for both, us and the user. But yeah, something around
that. It is going to be also implementation dependent.
The validating webhook?
Yeah, because I may want to, basically forwarding all these validation webhook to my own controller, which I might want to enforce certain rules relationship to each other. And how does that work? Instead of standardized, it's coming from the repo.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a couple things here. One, every implementation can choose to deploy the webhook as they want or not. So there's two things here. One, how are we choosing or documenting deploying the API in webhook? We have documentation that says that API and webhook are bundled together as one thing, and they combine to make up a release. So you install the CRDs and webhook at the same time. So if you're representing a managed provider, you may be the one that is providing an option that, hey, we'll install that for you. We'll manage the API version and webhook for you. But that's just one side of it. The other side I think you're describing is not just using the open source webhook, but maybe adding on some additional capabilities to it. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, exactly. Imagine, I have some, let's say, for example, the backend data plane supporting this is on external load balancer, right? So I might have some constraint over there. I need to validate, of them, for whatever reason, you have gateway, you have HTTP route, you have targets. The things I might need to put over there, it's very implementation specific, whatever I verify may not be applied for other implementation.
Yeah, that's an interesting case. I can say for GK, we haven't run into that yet, but I could see that being a possibility. We do plan on providing an option for users to have us manage the installation of the webhook. We haven't explored at this point any kind of addition to the webhook, but I can see that being a potentially useful thing. I get not knowing the specifics, but especially if it's some kind of implementation specific detail where you're trying to provide, some kind of immediate feedback to a user if they're providing some kind of invalid implementation specific config. I don't know. Does that sound like what you were describing?
Yeah, I think, that's what I'm saying here. Yeah, it's very implemented, the backend data plane. Which, kind of like the implementation dependent. Another confusion part I got from this is because I'm in the process.
Before you go on, Luan, can I just ask a question about the thing that you're doing about before we move on? Sorry to cut you off, but is that all right?
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, cool. So do you see that the vendor specific webhook things that you're talking about would be like a superset? So you would always be doing the upstream things and then some extra stuff on top? Or would you be changing how some of the upstream things work?
Yeah, I think right now, I haven't thought about this clearly, at least in my current POC, it's more of like a replacement. I would like to have all these modifications, especially if somebody tried to delete a gateway or delete the gateway class. I want to get the hook back to my own controller. And,
I see.
And then I want to do some own semantic checking based on my backend data plane, whatever the external load balancer implementation. So it's very my part.
Okay, so the reason I ask is that one of the things we're kind of doing with the webhook is to say, okay, the webhook is the place where we will define the validation that the open source that's part of the API itself.
Oh,
I see. So if you're not using the upstream webhook and we like change the upstream webhook, then you might end up being in conflict. And so I feel like a probably unwritten thing that we've said at the moment is to be gateway API compliant, you must be running the validation is like a thing that we haven't written down anywhere, I don't think at the moment, but I think that we need to write that down, or we need to have a policy about what do we do about the webhook. And so like we've kind of assumed everyone's just going to run it. And so I think your points are 100% fair, and it's completely fair to be able to do extra stuff on top of the webhook.
Oh, but not the replacement. Okay.
So I think that's I think that we don't have anything written down to tell people that, right? So I think in the example you talked about with deleting things, like it feels like finalizers would be the right way to do that, but rather than like patching the webhooks. But I feel like it feels to me like the most sustainable thing for the gateway API would be for, if you want to add additional validation, that's no problem, but you must always be using the upstream validation as a base level. And that way, because that's kind of part of the API, it's included in the bundle, like Rob said. And so, I feel like if we find that means that there's stuff that you can't do because you want to be able to like modify the exact validation that's there, then I think that is definitely a useful discussion to have now in alpha, before we call beta. And so I think we need to make sure that we have a consistent story for the webhook validation as part of the move to beta. Like, we need to have, how much validation do you need? Do you have to run the validation to be a compliant, like a V1 beta 1 compliant Gateway API install? My gut feeling is yes, but we haven't discussed that.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for pointing this out. I'll take this note back. Note to myself, for the implementation. I think one thing I was not sure today when I install the CRD, maybe that's my problem. I don't see the validation webhook being installed. Do I need to make any modification just use upstream webhook? It was not clear to me whether it seems like it's not running.
You're right. It's not clear in our docs right now at all. But the CRD installation is currently too far separated from the webhook installation. We say you need both, but in the actual docs, it's not clear, and I don't think we make it obvious at all how you would install a webhook.
Okay. So yeah, that was a confusion part, and then I went ahead because I was using KubeBuilder to bootstrap my controller. Then I went into KubeBuilder instruction to say, hey, here's the way how you create a webhook. That's got me so confused, And the second part about the using finalizer, I that's one thing I find. I don't know, maybe it's my understanding of finalizer is, if I have a finalizer, so say for example, if you want to delete a gateway, but gateway has an HTTP route attached to it, I can add in the finalizer logic, say, hey, you cannot delete. But the problem is when the user try to issue a delete, when you use a kubectl, I think the problem in that is the kubectl command gets stuck. When I say kubectl delete gateway, but my finalizer, hey, you cannot get the feedback to the user to say, hey, you need to delete the dependency first, delete all the backend ref to this HTTP route. Is basically stuck. How do people? This is from user perspective. That's why I say if I have a webhook, I capture this delete HTTP route, and I can do a check and then throw error code back to say, hey, you cannot delete. This one has dependencies.
I'm not sure the best way to handle that either. We've relied on finalizers for a number of our things, like cleaning up resources, cleaning up, cloud load balancers, for example, and it's not a great experience, but we haven't found a better one yet. I'm interested if anyone else has, but yeah, at least for us, it just kind of holds for a while. And what you're saying of not providing obvious or useful user feedback, is unfortunately true, at least in my experience. But
it also, like, I'm giving you an example today, like on AWS, when you delete a VPC, you get an error back to say, hey, you VPC or have some instance, you have dependency resource like EZ2 security group, go clean those things up. Then you call delete VPC, that will work. So similar thing like this for gateway. I do not want the gateway, if I say delete gateway without any warning, just automatically wipe out all the HTTP routes referred to, and more rather to say, hey, don't delete, you have dependency on this gateway, which I think the finalize, I cannot find a way to find the finalizer to do that. If finalize a return to say, hey, just return the error, so you cannot do it. And the user who's doing the kubectl delete gateway, it just stopped until a timeout.
Yeah, I agree. It is a terrible experience. I've had that happen before. And yeah, you also run into the fun thing where if the service that provides your finalizer is not available, then your delete will deadlock forever. There's probably some questions we could ask API machinery there about the right ways to do that sort of thing. But I think Harry put a good thing in the chat to remind people that you don't only have to have one. You can have multiple webhooks for any specific object. So there's no reason why you couldn't use the upstream one to do like the basic validation that we provide, and then have your own one that does like this sort of descendant, directed graph checking for you. And then, as you say, the good thing about the webhook is because it's on admission, you get that immediate feedback to the people. You can't, your delete was denied because you've got, go away and do other things before you try this again, is a much better user experience than the system is not proceeding to convergence because there's something stuck.
Got it. Yeah, thanks for the tips.
And Rob, I had a question for you. Like you mentioned this in passing before, where GKE plans to install the gateway API once it's a beta for users, during cluster provisioning. I'm assuming you'd also install the webhook in that, or?
Yeah.
Okay, so in that case, if I'm adding logic to webhook, that's fine. That's fine as long as whatever I'm validating is for my specific use case. But if let's say an implementation has decided to go against the API, and now let's say the upstream webhook, or rather the webhook of gateway API, is saying one thing and the implementation is saying another thing, now you can't create any resources because they two are in conflict.
So
Sorry, you want to go first, Rob?
no, go for it.
I was going to say, yeah, that feels like why we need to have very clear language that a bundle includes a webhook. You must include and run this webhook, and all these any additional webhook things you do must be a superset of the ones that we provide. They feel like the rules to me.
Yeah, I agree with that. I feel like that is not clearly communicated right now, but definitely needs to be.
I think it's a user experience problem. We should fix that make install to just include the webhook. Most people do that. And maybe also to whatever customized paths we have, we should include that, because people just install via those paths or just to install.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, so I think we can solve this reasonably straightforward with just a bit of work around, making the webhook installable easier, providing the YAML as part of the bundle, and being clear that you have to install the whole YAML to be a gateway API compliant. And then we'll need to lock all of that in with conformance tests, right? That we test in the conformance tests that stuff that should not pass the webhook does not pass validation. And so that way, if you are not running the upstream webhooks, then you can do. I think there's probably some space maybe where you might be able to say, hey, you can import the code from the upstream webhook and run it as in your own version of the webhook that then adds extra stuff on top, rather than running two separate ones if you really want. But like, we recommend just running two separate ones because that's Kubernetes is designed to work like that. They're probably good to have some sort of escape valve there.
Yeah, I agree. I think as long as it includes all the same, and that's, again, the purpose of conformance tests, as long as it covers the same functionality and it really is a superset, we're all right. Ideally, you're just running the OSS image directly, but I wouldn't be too prescriptive. I think our current OSS deployment config just has a how it generates certificates is probably not ideal for production use cases. So I can imagine that for many cases, they may want to deploy it slightly differently. But whatever. Okay, that's a lot of really good feedback and action items to go forward with. I'll try and create some tracking issues for this, and I don't remember if we already have a milestone, but I'll try and start getting that together for this. And if anyone has time and cycles to try and help out with making this better, very much appreciate any contributions. Anything else on webhook before we move on?
So this is potentially, I guess, going to be a container image, right? That would be downloaded and installed. Can we just get a point on like security scanning and dependency analysis.
Yeah, that's okay. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we need to be really clear in this language that when we do it, it's like you must have something that provides the same functionality as the upstream webhook API. If you want to, so you can take the upstream webhook API and do extra security scanning or whatever, but you must be doing the same thing, and we will have conformance tests that test the full surface of the, basically where the conformance test must also test the full surface of the webhook as well, so that if you're doing something else that's not the upstream webhook, that's cool, as long as it behaves in the exact same way. And that means that, again, the conformance tests are what lock in the API. And then when we release a new version, we must, if we add any extra validation, you must also add stuff to the conformance test to validate the validation. It turtles all the way down here, people.
Yeah, makes sense to me. Yeah, thanks for calling that out. We absolutely do need to make sure we have some kind of automation around that. I sure hope we have something we can rely on upstream and just build into our project, but I'm not that familiar to be sure.
We should hopefully also be able to piggyback off upstream, like SBOM kind of stuff that is happening for the upstream images, because I know that all of that stuff is already in progress.
Yeah, for sure. Cool.
Thanks, Matthew. That's a great call out there.
Okay, so the next thing on here is just API changes. I think we may have all the gaps in that are in scope for V1 Beta 1. If anyone has something else they're thinking about, actually there is one in triage. So maybe there's one more, I'm not sure. But I'm not aware of any others that are on the horizon. If anyone has something that they're really trying to get in to V1 Beta 1, please let us know ASAP, because I think V1 Beta 1 is awfully close right now. I should also highlight that everything we're doing based on the next two bullet points is really anything is going into experimental first and then eventually maybe graduating to stable. So it's not like it's a big milestone to get it into the very first release of V1 Beta 1. That there's still room to add things later. This is just, again, the first release of V1 Beta 1.
I have a question. Has anyone tried to, do we have any feedback of people trying to use the policy API? Like people, like anyone having created a custom policy and used a reference policy?
I have gotten some feedback from implementers. I have not gotten feedback from users.
Okay, is that implementer feedback good? Like we don't have anything on that front, so that's the only part of the API where I'm a little concerned. That's all.
Very understandable. And it's a weird part of the API because we're not actually releasing any policy resource. It's just, this is a type that you should extend to create your own resources to, and a pattern in it. So you're right. I wonder if there's some guarding we can do for it. Guarding is maybe not the right word, but communicate that this concept is not yet beta. I don't know, because you're right. I don't think that's an area that we have any real usage of. I think we have at least some implementers working away on policy, but I don't know of any released policy using that model yet.
And we do have a CRD for that, right? So
We have a skeleton for how your CRD should look, because remember the way that it works is you're actually creating a policy your own policy CRD that has a certain shape, and that's what the API actually says about, like, your policy should have a certain shape, and then it should attach in this way, and the settings should flow in this way or that sort of stuff. We don't actually say anything about what I'm pretty sure we said something like it needs to have this field and this field and this field, but aside from that, you're on your own. So I feel like this is one where some guards and a work example, maybe like a trivial example that you could do anyway with the API that you know, like that's like, here's how you would do this with the policy engine or something like that, might be the way to go. Like a trivial example that any proxy could implement would seem to be something good. I mean, you know, the obvious one that we talked about a lot was timeouts, but it turns out that you can't use the same timeouts across everybody because everybody does it different, right? So yeah, if we can find something that everybody does that's that might be worth, like maybe something like limiting like something about a HTTP route that don't attach to a gateway, or just some other like something where you take some like relatively obvious thing and you do a policy for it, so that then there's a worked example of that somewhere that should help people understand what we're trying to achieve with the API. That's Mike just put in the chat, enforcing a TLS min version was one policy that they were looking at implementing. That one is almost certainly going to be possible across every proxy implementation, and that having a worked example of like, here's how you would implement that, maybe even considering including that as like part of the upstream API to be like the example, the canonical reference example, might be good, and making it like implementation specific support or something like that. But yeah, having an example I think would really help people here, because I get it, because I spent like 2 or 3 days like at the time like figuring out how it worked. But like I can totally get that if you haven't spent 2 or 3 days reading the gaps and parsing it and understanding why you would use this at all, then it might be a bit impenetrable.
So one correction there, if we do ship a CRD of the reference policy CRD itself, or what we may call it.
The reference policy is not one of those policies. That is a naming problem. So the reference policy is not like a policy like in the same way that those are policies where it effectively attaches to a specific resource and then flows. It's a policy that covers cross namespace references. That is a problem on naming on our part that maybe we should consider changing that name, Rob, before we go to beta.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of connected, right? Like one doesn't make sense without the other. So, or rather it does, right? If you have, I'm not sure, but
I mean, maybe we need to throw away the policy word and only use policy to describe that specific, the policy extension mechanism. I don't know what else you would call it if not reference policy though. Naming things, right?
Yeah, naming things is awful. I get the overlap and I think it's unfortunate, but I don't know. I can't think of a good alternative right now for names. I think, Harry, what you may have been asking for is like, do we have any meaningful usage and feedback for reference policy, like as one of your initial questions? And I need to spend some time going back through, but I think I actually do have more meaningful feedback on this. But that's just the one, probably not enough. I'm interested in if others have implemented this yet. Again, this is a new concept. I think we've gotten good feedback. It's being implemented, or concepts like this are being implemented by others. I've gotten some interest in the community about using reference policy for other use cases. So I think this is a good starting point, but I'd like to just try and aggregate that feedback and usage and discussion somewhere. And especially, I'd say the feedback here is still pretty biased towards implementers or very, very, very early adopters. Reference strategy. Go ahead.
At this point, like I think all of the feedback we're going to get is from implementers or early adopters. I need to check, but I'm pretty confident that Steve K implemented reference policy for Contour. And if so, I can't remember if he's done it or not, but it should be trivial to use reference policy to do the same thing as our old TLS certificate delegation does for HTTP proxy. I mean, the reference policy is basically a more flexible version of the TLS certificate delegation thing that we had in HTTP proxy for ages. So, I mean, in terms of the general constructs, I'm pretty confident that we're headed in the right direction with the reference policy. It's going to be little details like like stuff like, oh, the from namespace was optional and stuff like that we fixed. That's going to trip us up. Not the broad strokes concepts. But I think that the name is, even retro strategy is probably slightly better than reference policy because there's no overlap with another thing that's totally different that we talk about. I think that's the problem, is that we've got two things that are going to be called X policy. Reference policy is one of them, and it's completely different and implemented using a completely different mechanism than your custom timeout policy. That have a very similar name. I hate naming things so much.
Yeah, naming is the worst.
I think we should just collect this, Rob, a little, because probably the API reviewers will ask us that you have had some, like at least multiple people looking at it. Like other resources, I think we have had enough people implementing that. If we are reasonably confident, this one, there have been definitely talks about it, some references to it, but not enough. And it's a bit of a security problem as well, so hence the hesitation. That's all.
Yeah, no, that's a good one to call out for sure. I'll create an issue to try and track any kind of usage or feedback, and hopefully we can get a few different people to contribute anything that we may receive. But yeah, I agree.
So it feels like we've got really two blockers for beta at the moment. From out of this discussion, we've got something about reference policy and fixing up the webhook stuff. Those are beta blockers.
I agree. And also, I'd say along with that, although it was not the initial intent of this conversation, finding a way to communicate the stability of our policy attachment model, because it has not been used yet as well. It's not a CRD. It's not exposed in the same way, but maybe we need to be a little bit cautious in how we document that model. I'm not sure.
I mean, I think because we don't have CRDs, we could probably just say this is still experimental, right? Like there's no CRDs provided. We could just mark that in those documents as this is experimental and could change.
That's probably safest. Okay, yeah. All right, so I'll just definitely make sure it's experimental. I think that makes sense here. Okay, next up, I will go through and try and turn a lot of these into issues themselves. There's a lot of discussion and work here, but I think what you distilled down to the two real blockers, maybe 2.5, as reference policy and cleaning up webhooks are both significant efforts. All right, the next one is docs, and our docs are, they're showing their that they've really just been added to and not really, holistically written from scratch recently. And so there's work that can be done, especially as we move to V1 Beta 1. One of the things that is going to change with V1 Beta 1 is that we're going to have really no difference between V1 Beta 1 and V1 Alpha 2, and I expect that will continue indefinitely. So our way of representing that is going to get a little messy. I can't imagine having separate docs for V1 Beta 1 and V1 Alpha 2. Maybe at some point we have separate docs for different bundle versions. I'm not sure. What I think Shane was the pioneer of this. This is our first documentation that is guarded as this is an experimental feature. But actually I realized after we got this in that we should really guard it with experimental feature to be released in 0.5.0, because our docs in some cases are getting ahead of what's actually released. That's another thing that hard to find the right balance. So anyway, this is how we're currently representing experimental features. There's room for improvement. So I think this is a good start. I'm glad that we have a starting point for experimental features. Thank you, Shane, for adding this. It's like, yeah, I completely missed it with rewrites. And so we need some work on that and some work on just explaining what experimental and stable mean in this context. And then the other thing I'm thinking about very, very much is V1 Alpha 1 docs. I think with our transition to V1 Beta 1, we may be nearing a point where we can either remove or mostly hide V1 Alpha 1 documentation. I don't think it's very widely used right now, or I don't think it will be for a long time. So maybe we can link out to a basically static and unchanged V1 Alpha 1 set of documentation. I don't know. Any strong opinions on how long we should leave these docs around?
It feels like it'd be nice to have them around in some version, but it also feels to me like maybe, I think your point about the bundle version is actually like chef's kiss, because that feels like the way that we can make this much better. If we changed the website to be a bit more like the Upstream Cube website, where, you know, the docs are sliced at the very toppest of levels by the version. If we do that via the bundle version, and we have like basically a separate version of the docs for each bundle version, that's like updating the docs as part of the bundle version, all that sort of stuff. That means that you pick your bundle version and then you get the docs that are appropriate for that, right? So the 0.4.1 docs will still have V1 Alpha 1 because it's kind of still around. And so it's still available, but it's not available on the most current version, right? And that's going to be good because it's similar to what's upstream in Kubernetes, and it gives us the way to handle this sort of stuff going forwards. And then it means that if you pick the 0.6.0 thing, then we can remove the experimental tags in that one and say in 0.5.1, this is experimental. In 0.6.0, this is not experimental, right? Like to do that, probably we're going to have to do the similar sort of thing to what the upstream does and have like use one of the tools, the Hugo tools that lets you have like versions of the thing, and it makes like a branch, and you know, there's a whole bunch of shenanigans to make that actually happen. But I feel like that would be the desirable end goal, because then that would solve a few of these problems and make the website a bit easier to navigate at the same time. Yeah, we're probably going to need some help from people from SIG docs, from Kubernetes SIG docs, to actually make that happen, I would guess.
I agree. I think that's been in, you know, something that we knew we had to get to eventually, and this may be the forcing function, you know, getting to a third API version. That's going to be a much better user experience. I think it means, last I checked, it was difficult or impossible to do with make docs in our current structure. So I think what you're saying really is it means switching out to an entirely different docs generation system.
Which
We'll
is a bunch
see.
of work.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I would say that's figuring out what we do about docs is blocker number 3.5.
Yeah, I agree. Cool. Okay, well, I'll if anyone has good contacts in SIG docs, it'd be great to have a discussion with them around how we can structure this. It does seem like Hugo is pretty widely used, but yeah, anyone who can help would be very appreciated. With that, I want to just open this up. Is there anything else that I haven't listed here that we should be thinking about when it comes to V1 Beta 1?
I have something maybe not related to V1 Beta 1. It's more of a question to the community. I understand I see example like we have, you know, backend for actually in the context of multi-cluster, you know, say in example, I have one HTTP route which can point to backend a service, which is a service import. Question I have is more on the HTTP route itself. Let's imagine I have two backends. One is deployed in the cluster 1 service, you know, back version 1 in cluster 1, and service 2 in cluster 2. I may have an app in the cluster 1 want to reference, you know, both cluster 1, version 1 and version 2, but I may also have another app in the second cluster also want to reference the same thing. You know, imagine I have this service thing called inventory. I have a HTTP route inventory route. I have two versions, one on one cluster, one on the other cluster. Two clusters may have two different versions, right? I have running Kubernetes 1.21, second one maybe around 1.22, two clusters both have a client. I may have a client one in cluster one need to reference this inventory HTTP route for two backend. I also can have another version of a client, another app in the second cluster, want to reference the same service, HTTP route service, which has two backend. So what do we do with HTTP route object? Do we define the same thing in both cluster to replicate the same thing, or any thought on that?
So that's an interesting point. One ask I have is, can you write it down like in a diagram? Because I don't know if everyone caught all the relationships there. There's two things, which is one, right now in terms of the Kubernetes community, there is one cross-cluster notion, which is the multi-cluster service. So that's why, for the most part, the only kinds of references that we talk about are just to multi-cluster service. It sounds like you're asking, okay, what if we could have references cross-cluster for other resources?
Yeah, HTTP
that one
routes. Yeah,
that one I think has come up before. It's something that we have to figure out in conjunction with probably SIG multi-cluster, because we could pick one semantic for gateway APIs, but what if it conflicts with what people have for like storage volumes and then the other stuff? So my general thinking is like, we should ask that question, but kind of more broadly. And if it's the case that SIG multi-cluster kind of says like, well, we don't care, like you guys can kind of figure out a semantic yourself, then we can talk about solving it just in gateway. I hesitate to like do something specific for gateway if there's not a more general pattern, because then from a user standpoint, in terms of like using Kubernetes APIs, it's like it gets a little bit disjointed.
Mhm.
That being said, like in terms of our experience, is that we've been talking to users and they are generally okay with kind of centralizing their config because it makes it easier for them to think about. Although we did have questions like, hey, what if we can do cross-cluster references? Which gets back to the original point, like, what about cross-cluster resource references in general? Like, what kind of, is there a general pattern we should be following?
Yeah.
And the thing about multi-cluster service is that it has a notion of like, you have a bunch of cooperating clusters in the same administrative domain, and one service in one cluster, if it's exported, is the same as the other service is being exported. It's because there's very little configuration on service. It's almost the only configuration is the fact that it's exported. It's more difficult, for example, if you have a route with some contents and then the route with different contents, and what if they conflict when you merge them? So that one, you kind of need to understand what the user wants to do with it, because as a user, as a API, we don't want to give it something to the user where they can very easily get very confused and not understand like which one is the one that's being implemented or the one that's being synced to the LB. Like, you get what I'm saying? Like, it has to be very clear kind of their intent and then how it maps.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah, maybe I can put example topology I have in mind to the Slack later on.
Yeah, I think a Google Doc or some other sort of shareable document that we can collaborate on would be a good idea, so people can like make comments and ask questions on the document.
Sure.
We found that works really well before. Yeah, and having the diagram at the top, that's okay.
Yeah, I agree. I'd echo everything that's been said before, and any kind of concrete use cases, and it sounds like you've got some, would really help. so far, I think what Bowie has said is my limited experience too, is that just for a lot of use cases, having all your gateway API config in a single cluster can work. But I know that that is not every case. And so having some, very clear use cases we're working towards could help.
Okay.
Cool. Any last thoughts on this or anything else that we might want to think about in V1 Beta 1?
I think we should be at least considering what you and I were talking about, and there was a draft up that John Howard was talking with us about for how you express load balancing strategies for HTTP backend refs.
Yeah, I saw that. I saw that discussion, Shane, I have been away for a month and I'm reviewing my GitHub notifications, and I got about 7 or 8 comments deep and went, save, I'm going to come back to this one later. Because it looks interesting, but it looks like it needs quite a bit of parsing. I do appreciate the images that you put in there. But yeah, I might hit you up to talk about that one a little bit more. I feel like it has the smell of being important to me, but it also feels nightmarishly subtle, maybe that it's going to be very easy for people to not understand what we're talking about there without really clear language.
Yeah, I have to come back and do another pass at it. It's at the end of the day, if we go into V1 Beta 1 without the ability for somebody to make multiple backend refs and an easy way for them to express how they want those balanced, and I guess at what level they want those balanced, at the actual backend refs or the targets. Although I'm not sure about how that looks yet. But not being able to just say, yeah, I want least connections between all of these services seems like a miss in the API right now.
I wish there was a good way to represent this for all implementations and there was a consistent way, but yeah, that issue, I dug into it too, and I was underwhelmed by, or overwhelmed maybe, by the different configs available across different implementations I looked at. And there's some things that look similar on the surface, but the details are different. And then there's others that they support all things but X. I'm not sure. One of the takeaways from that is, hey, maybe policy is actually not a bad solution here. I don't know.
Yeah, policy, you and I talked about this, but the policy seems like I have to get back to it, but that might be the way we have to do it, just since it's so complex and we're running low on time, and because of the variance and how everybody implements this. But I do think it's gonna be something later down the road. We're gonna be like, man, I really wish we could have had a way to do that.
I mean, so Harry, you tried to talk before and you didn't get to, so it's your turn.
Yeah, so I think this is a problem at 2 layers, right? And at one layer we have addressed it, and the other layer we intentionally left it out. So one is, let's say you have only one backend ref, and that references a service that has npods. You want to do any kind of load balancing between them, that has to be a policy resource. We discussed this at length, and that's where we have policy resources. So we do allow for, okay, you want to do weighted load balancing or least connection or whatever, you can do that all vendor or implementation specific load balancing. And that is considered not a workaround, but a solution that we have designed for. The second thing is, okay, you have multiple services and you can only do weighted load balancing between those, which is not really load balancing, but we designed it for canarying, right? Like canarying traffic. That was the only use case that we had in mind. Now, load balancing across these 2 different services is an advanced enough use case that if we try to shove it in the API, doing it in an implementation agnostic fashion is not going to work based on whatever we have read so far in so many different implementations, right? So in that case, resorting to using policy for such a solution, I don't think is a I don't think it's a workaround or a bad solution. It's a pretty good compromise rather, and it proves that reference policy is rather good at solving these kinds of corner cases.
I think the thing I was going to add there was that I think it's important to remember that for the generalized policy mechanism, we kind of want to, again, it's not in the docs, but in my mind, a lot of what we're talking about here is actually going to be, most of the policy stuff a lot of the time is about the data plane, not about the control plane, if you have a separation between them. But so it's about what proxy you're using or what method you're using to do this. So it would kind of make sense that, if you're going to do this sort of thing and allow and say, hey, you can set a load balancer policies or load balancing types strategies is the word. Then you have like a envoy load balancing strategy rather than a contour load balancing strategy, right? Because the load balancing strategy is going to attach in a similar way and have the same options based on the data plane, not on the actual controller that's implementing it. For a lot of people, those are the same thing, right? But for contour, it's not, and that I think is a useful thing to remember. But I completely see what you're saying, Shane, and I think it's worth at least having had the discussion and ensuring that everyone is on the same page about where we solve this problem and like that we've written down, we've considered this problem and we've said policy is the right way to do this because there's no thing, or we've made a change to the API and actually implemented it. It doesn't matter as long as we've all talked about it enough that we all understand where we're at and where everyone is happy enough with the compromise that we reached. Does that make sense, Shane?
Yeah, I mean, I closed the draft PR that I had open basically because I'm kind of coming to the acceptance that policy is going to have to be good enough. I can defer on that and just go with it.
I mean, I think that it's probably still worth, like, it feels like policy is the right thing to me because of the likely difference in the strategies and stuff like that. Like, it'd be, if you didn't do policy, you had something like where you picked a load balancer strategy in the upstream API, what would happen is that you would have specific values. It would be like a string probably that had specific values that were core and specific values that were implementation specific, which we've done in like, which might be a viable option, right? But then it doesn't also allow you to do the other more complicated stuff that you were talking about with load balancing between routes or load balancing between targets, as opposed to just load balancing across backends, because you've got the different levels. And so, yeah, I'd say don't you have a discouraged sound to your voice that I feel bad about. And so, like, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, the fact that, I mean, you need it, right? Like, you're coming and asking to it. You spend a lot of effort on talking to us about why you need it, right? Like, talking to the community about why you need it. Don't discount the fact that you need it, because if you need it, probably someone else is going to need it, right? And like, and we need to make sure that we're addressing it in the best way we can for everybody, not just because you're the only person who understands it yet, right? Like, you're probably right that other people are going to need this, and there's a good chance that we will say, hey, we missed this. And so let's be 100% sure that if we're going to say that, we'll be like, well, we thought about it the best we could at the time, and we made a mistake. But like, we all can smell the idea that maybe there's a mistake to be made here. Let's put a bit of effort in and make sure and do our best to be that we don't miss something obvious. So yeah, that's what I'm trying to say.
I appreciate it. I'm not discouraged. I just don't have a good argument against using policy now, because I understand the context that we are all not dealing with backends that are going to do the same things. So.
I did really like the idea that Nick kind of mentioned just briefly there of maybe there's still room for sharing, but it's, on a per underlying implementation level. Like, maybe you can share per Nginx, we have a generic thing that here are all Nginx capabilities, or maybe that's a bad idea. I don't know, but or maybe I misunderstood what you were saying. But I am somewhat interested in this idea that maybe there's subsets of implementations that can still share config. So we don't need to have everyone completely reinvent everything. Because I know we'll likely have several implementations based on Nginx and Envoy and probably HA proxy too. So yeah.
Bowie, you unmuted.
Yeah, I guess is it the case that this is additive to the API? I'm just thinking in terms of like making a decision now, or kind of letting a bit more time and kind of proposals get through.
The big thing go ahead. So, sorry, the big thing that bit us with Ingress is that when you add something, you can't change the behavior of existing config. So basically you have to default to either completely empty, and whatever you add is forever optional, and the empty config is just unknown, implementation specific, whatever, which is probably fine here. But it does.
Yeah, I'm just thinking like if this is like an advanced, it's a difference between Ingress, which is everyone's expecting some sort of behavior and their expectation was wrong, versus like an advanced knob that people who really want it will add it and then expect a particular behavior. So I don't know, like I have to look at the proposal in detail, but I'm trying to gauge, like, do we need to solve it now, or is there more time to like get to a conclusion?
To be clear, there was no real proposal. Mostly just like me kind of throwing some stuff out there and seeing what's stuck. So there was never a real proposal for the alternative to using policy.
Okay.
Okay, so you go, Rob.
No, so yeah, I know we're at time, so I do want to move along, but I think there's room to at least track that this discussion happened and where we landed. Maybe that's in the gap issue or anyway, but yeah, there was good discussion here today, and I think we should just track that and note it down somewhere. The last thing we are going to run out of time. We've already briefly covered timeline. We have an idea of blockers, so I want to move very quickly on to PR and issue triage to at least mention these. I have a PR out that's just adding the conformance test. There was an initial conformance test PR that merged, and I split out some additional conformance tests into a follow-up. That's just sitting there. If anyone has some time to take a look, could use a set of review. And then the other one that has had significant conversation is the idea of section name on routes. I think so far a lot of the pushback has been that there's been significant pushback just on the idea of adding this right now. But I'm interested in what others think. So that's PR 996. This is our gap that's in progress right now. So really interested in broader feedback on this one. And yeah, we're at time, so I don't want to go over, but great discussion all around. Any last things before we end the meeting today? Cool. All right, well, thanks everyone. We'll see you online and talk to you next week. See you.